Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're cracking open a rather dense but absolutely fascinating early 20th century anthropological text. It's a text that tries to map out the very origins of Malabar, Cochin, and Travancore, the region you probably know today as Kerala. We're going to peel back the layers of this ancient melting pot together. We'll be exploring the whole shebang, from massive geological shifts and ancient Roman trade, right down to some incredibly complex social assimilation.
Here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at origins and early myths. Then, trade in ancient Tamilakam. Third, early inhabitants and tribes. And finally, Aryan arrival in society. Let's get right into it. So let's start with a really brilliant metaphor straight from our source text. It actually describes this region as a happy and undisturbed fossiliferous stratum. Essentially, it's a living museum. You see, because this land was geographically tucked away for so long, caught between the towering Western Ghats and the sea, it perfectly preserved layers upon layers of ancient human history. We're talking ancient religions, laws, and customs, all somehow just coexisting side by side. Section 1. Origins and Early Myths. Right off the bat, there's this really stark contrast between myth and science when it comes to how this land was formed. On one hand, you have the traditional origin story. According to myth, the hero Parasurama, an incarnation of Vishnu, actually prayed for a brand new plot of land to colonize for Brahmins, basically seeking expiation for his past sins. And boom, the land was gifted to him. But on the flip side, the scientific, geological explanation points to something entirely different. It suggests either a sudden massive subterranean upheaval from the sea, or maybe a gradual recession of the waters, which eventually formed this long, narrow coastal strip. Now, according to those early traditions, Parasurama didn't just create the land. He ordered the strict observance of religion and charity on it. And this gave rise to a really important concept, karma bhumi. That translates to the land where salvation has to be obtained by doing good actions. It's a powerful legend, right? And it actually played a massive role in justifying the incredibly strict religious rules and societal structures we see early on in the region's history.
Moving on to Section 2. Trade in Ancient Tamilakam.
Because of its unique geography, this region had commodities that were practically impossible to find anywhere else in the world. We're talking specifically about pepper and precious beryls. As early as the 7th or 8th century BC, foreign merchants were already showing up just for the pepper. Then, by the 1st to 3rd centuries AD, Roman trade in the area had absolutely peaked. I mean, pepper was so incredibly valuable in Europe at the time that in 409 AD, when Alaric the Goth levied a war indemnity against Rome, his terms literally included a ransom of 3,000 pounds of pepper. That is wild. And honestly, this just brilliantly illustrates how deeply interconnected the ancient world actually was. The text even notes that Romans settled in the area. In fact, it says the powerful Yavanas, which was the local term for these foreigners, clad in complete armor, acted as bodyguards to Tamil kings. Just imagine that for a second. Heavily armored Roman soldiers acting as personal bodyguards for local kings in southern India. It really highlights an astonishing level of early global exchange. So what does this all mean? Well, this huge influx of people brought a really rapid succession of religious shifts, way before European colonists ever showed up. The original inhabitants practiced local forms of devil worship, as the text calls it. But soon, Jainism was introduced around 309 BC. After that came Buddhism, which was actually imported by Emperor Ashoka's own brother. By the 7th century, though, Hinduism had largely overshadowed all of the others, pushing those earlier indigenous practices into the background.
All right, Section 3. Early inhabitants and tribes.
Our source text dedicates a really significant chunk of its research to the Aboriginal hill tribes of the area. Take a look at this, a Gond tribesman gathering honey high up in the forest trees. It perfectly captures how these groups lived in almost complete isolation from the plains below. They relied on some absolutely incredible survival techniques and had this intimate, deep-rooted knowledge of the incredibly rugged terrain around them. And they really needed that ingenuity to survive alongside some seriously fierce wildlife. This primitive tiger trap built by the locals is a perfect example of their rugged, totally nature-dependent lifestyle. These original inhabitants lived a life that was entirely dictated by the harsh, yet beautiful environment of the Western Ghats. Now, the author uses the ethnological frameworks of the early 20th century to classify these groups.
They refer to pre-Dravidian races and Negrito elements as the earliest Aboriginals, who were then followed by migrating Dravidians. But here is where it gets truly fascinating. To explain the physical similarities between these indigenous groups and peoples in places like Africa and Australia, naturalists at the time actually proposed the theory of Lemuria. This was a hypothetical, massive, lost continent that they believed once stretched all the way across the Indian Ocean. No way, right? The text is also packed with numerous photographs documenting these diverse groups, like these Vetua women from the forests of North Malabar. Ethnologists of that era were obsessed with studying their unique customs, their animistic beliefs, and their incredibly deep-rooted social structures. These were societies entirely distinct from the civilizations that were developing up in the north of India at the time.
Which brings us to Section 4, Aryan Arrival and Society.
The author breaks down the colonization of Kerala by the number 3 Brahmins, or the Aryans, into 3 very distinct chronological steps. First up, there was a military invasion, which often faced some seriously fierce opposition from the locals. Second, a period of local settlement where new villages were gradually established. And finally, a long, super complex period of social assimilation and national consolidation. But here's the catch. This assimilation was incredibly difficult because the two cultures were essentially polar opposites. The arriving Aryan system was strictly patriarchal, with primogeniture and rigid caste roles. The indigenous system, on the other hand, was deeply matriarchal. Descent was reckoned strictly through the female line, and clans were entirely based on maternal bloodlines. It was a total clash of worlds.
So how on earth did they consolidate? Well, through a highly strategic and quite unique evolution of a caste hierarchy. The number 3 Brahmins had this rule where only the eldest son inherited property, so they allowed their younger sons to form matrimonial alliances with the women of the non-Aryan groups, like the Nayars. Over time, this slow infusion of groups bound the conquerors and the conquered together. But, as you might guess, it also created an intensely rigid caste system, complete with endless grades of subordination, just to guard against any further intermixture. Seeing a historical group like this, Brahmins and non-Brahmins together in Trichur, it perfectly anchors exactly what the author is describing. We're looking at distinct groups that, over centuries of military conflict, strategic marriages, and shared governance, eventually intermingled. They ended up shaping the uniquely layered society of the region. It's like a giant puzzle coming together. The conquerors adopted the local language, while the locals absorbed the religious and social rules of the conquerors. And that, my friends, brings us to the end of our journey through this incredible historical text. But it leaves us with a really compelling question to ponder. How does the legacy of this ancient layered assimilation, everything from geological shifts to Roman trade routes, from Aboriginal hill tribes to this complex matriarchal and patriarchal blending, how does all of that continue to shape the vibrant culture of the region today? I want you to think about that living museum of human history the next time you look at a map of South Asia. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep staying curious.